Okay, so the first thing you want to do before you start anything with a power steering pump job is to remove the serpentine belt. I've got a long serpentine belt tool here. You can use a breaker bar or anything pretty much. Just something that gives you the leverage to work on the tensioner here. So anyway, from here we'll pull the tensioner over and take the belt off. Okay. Be sure you take note of how the belt is oriented before you take the belt off. The vehicles don't often have the belt routing diagrams on them anymore. Okay, so we've got the belt out of the way, so we can go ahead and go to the next step. Okay, we're going to go ahead and let the power steering reservoir drain out once we've got the hose disconnected from the power steering cooler. The power steering cooler is the one that's in front of the radiator, and one of the hoses from the power steering cooler goes directly to the bottom of the power steering reservoir. You might also want to take the power steering reservoir cap off to let the power steering fluid flow out a little bit easier. And while you're waiting for this to drain out, now is a good time to remove the serpentine belt. Okay, so once you have the serpentine belt off, you can go ahead and rotate the power steering pulley until you can see the 3 bolts holding the power steering pump to the engine block. You're going to want to go ahead and loosen those up to remove the pump. But before you do that, you're going to want to undo the power steering line from the bottom of the pump. This takes a 16mm wrench. You want to be sure to put some containment down below because you will spill some fluid out in the process. So do that, remove the hose, the power steering line, and these 3 bolts, and the pump should come right out. Okay, now depending on what your replacement power steering pump is like, you may need to remove the original power steering pulley and possibly the reservoir. If you need to remove the reservoir, pretty simple. There's a couple of Torx screws right here. It is a T30 to remove those. Anyway, we'll get going to the new pump here just shortly. And this is why I'm a huge advocate about checking the parts before you walk away from the parts counter. This is what I found in the box. My nice new pump with a reservoir. It was supposed to be a real easy job. It has a broken nipple here, so I'm going to have to go ahead and reuse the old reservoir. Okay, once you get the 2 T30 screws out, the reservoir just pops off of the pump this way to the right. Let's see if I can do it by hand here. Right. Like so. So it just pops off like that. There's an O-ring, a couple of O-rings on the nipple there, and you'll probably get some more fluid coming out. Now, if you have to reuse the reservoir, I highly suggest that you clean it thoroughly before you install it on the new pump. Alright, I've got the old reservoir transferred over to the new pump. Everything else seems to be in order. So now it's just time to install it. Pretty much goes back in reverse of removal. So what we've got to do is bolt the power steering pump back onto the front of the engine block with these 3 bolts that I've cleaned up, 13mm head, and we'll see you in the next clip. Okay, once you've got the pump mounted up to the block, you want to tighten each of these 3 bolts to 16 foot-pounds. From there, you're going to want to install the power steering pressure line to the pump here. Be sure to use the supplied O-ring that usually comes with your power steering pump. If not, if you don't have an O-ring that comes with it, then you're going to have to get a replacement one from a reputable auto parts store. Okay, so the last part here before we start putting fluid in the reservoir is to put the belt back on. Basically reverse to how we removed it. We're going to use the serpentine belt tool on the tensioner. Like so. We're going to go ahead and run the belt the same way it was before we took it apart. Tool to give us enough slack. Okay. So the last thing we want to do is just make sure that the belt is centered on all of the pulleys. Make sure that the belt is in its proper place, and in this case it looks like we're very good to go. Now we can proceed with filling the power steering reservoir and bleeding the power steering pump. Okay, well, because I live in Alaska, I decided I'm going to use a fully synthetic ATF for this. This truck calls for Dexron 3 for the power steering fluid, not the Mopar ATF plus 4. It has to be the Dexron. Sometimes it's known as MD3 because GM no longer allows anyone to use a Dexron name. Anyway, this is the synthetic stuff that I'm going to use. It works better here in Alaska where we have really cold winters. In my location, sometimes it gets down to -40, and yeah, that's without the wind chill, so that's pretty darn cold. So anyway, I'm just going to use a funnel to fill it up a little bit at a time. And periodically I'm going to stick the cap back on and fill it up to, well, this engine's kind of warm, so I'm going to fill it up to a little over the add mark on hot. Okay, the next thing I like to do is lift the vehicle off the ground. I'm not going to be getting back underneath it, so I'm not going to bother with the jack stands. So once the level is full, we'll run the steering wheel back and forth manually. Before we even start the truck up, to try to bleed any air that might be in the rack before we start it. And before we start it, we'll check the fluid level too. And as you might be able to see here, the fluid level dropped down just a little bit after I bled the system without the vehicle running. Probably can't see it because it's so light, but the level dropped down to the add mark. So I'm just going to add a little bit more before I start it up. Okay, got the fluid top back up, and now I'm going to start the engine and turn the wheel left to right. You don't want to hold it to the stop on each side. Just as soon as you bump it, turn the wheel the other direction. All right. Now we're gonna check the fluid again. Okay, so we ran the steering wheel left to right a few times until things started to feel smooth. And now we'll shut the engine back off, and I'm going to check the reservoir to see if the fluid level dropped. Usually it drops a little bit as it burps the air out. Well, as you can see here, it's not even on the dipstick. So what I'll do is I'll put more fluid in it until it's between the add and hot mark. And I'm going to put the cap back on, start the engine back up, and run the steering wheel left to right a few more times. And then check the fluid level again. And we're just going to keep doing that until the fluid level stays steady. And you want it between the add and the hot mark on a hot engine, and add and cold on a cold engine. Okay, so I had to top it off a few times and start it up and turn the wheel, and I think we got to a point now where the fluid level has settled, and yeah, it looks like the level is perfectly in between full hot and add. So I'm going to call that a win.